The dust in Bodie, California never truly settled. It hung in the air like a heavy golden veil. It tasted of dry earth and old, forgotten failures. In the year 1882, the sun was a relentless tyrant. It beat down on the town's warped wooden sidewalks. The heat was a physical weight on the shoulders of every traveler. Bodie was a place of gold and greed. It was a town where a man's life was worth less than a vein of silver. Outside the local bakery, the air was different. It was thick with the scent of rising sourdough. The smell of sweet molasses drifted through the open door. For the miners, it was a smell of comfort and home. For An Lee, it was a refined form of torture. She sat on a low wooden crate in the narrow alley. Her back was pressed against the rough, splintered slats of the wall. The wood was hot from the afternoon sun. Her stomach had passed the stage of sharp, stabbing pain hours ago. Now it was just a deep, hollow ache. It made her head light and her vision blur at the edges. She had not eaten for 3 full days. On the first day, she had asked 2 strangers for help. One ignored her completely. The other answered with a cruel word she did not understand. After that, she stopped asking. She simply watched the strangers walk past. Every time someone glanced her way, she lowered her eyes. She was afraid another blow of words would follow. When she finally tried to stand, her trembling legs nearly gave out. She was small, her frame delicate and brittle. Exhaustion kept pulling her shoulders forward. She was wrapped in a dirt-stained red silk wedding tunic. The fabric had been beautiful once. It was embroidered with golden threads of peonies and phoenixes. They used to shimmer in the light of a distant home. Now the silk was frayed and caked with the grit of the Sierras. It was a shroud for a dream that had died in the cradle. An Lee was a mail-order bride. That was what the contract in her pocket claimed. She had traveled across a vast, terrifying ocean. She had crossed a continent on a rattling iron train.
She came to marry a man she had never once met. But Bodie was a cruel place for dreams. When she arrived, she found only a fresh mound of dirt. The local cemetery held her future. Mr. Chen, the merchant, had died of a sudden, violent fever. The townspeople were quick to act. They seized his shop. They took his gold and his crates of tea. No one wanted the girl who spoke no English. To the miners, she was just unwanted cargo from the Orient. She watched the feet of the people passing by. Heavy leather boots crunched on the gravel. Ladies in fine silk dresses swished past her crate. The women lifted their skirts away from the dusty boards. They hurried past without looking at her. No one looked down at the girl in the red silk. She felt like a ghost. She was a spirit haunting a town that only believed in gold. 3 miles away, a different kind of silence reigned. Silas Thorne lived in a world of sagebrush and ancient pines. He was a man of the high country. His hands were calloused and scarred from the plow. He was broad-shouldered and tall. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow. But beneath the strength, there was a hollow in his chest. His wife Clara had been gone for 5 long years. The cabin was painfully quiet when he returned each evening. One chair at the table remained untouched. Sometimes he caught himself looking toward it. He would wait for a voice that never came. Then he would remember that no one would ever sit there again. The silence in his home had grown louder every winter. It felt like a physical weight against his heart. He had come to Bodie for basic supplies. He needed a sack of flour and a block of salt. He hadn't come to save a soul. He parked his wagon near the center of town. His black saddle horse, tied behind the wagon, shifted impatiently. Silas paused to tighten a loose strap beneath the saddle.
As he pulled the leather through the buckle, he glanced over his shoulder. The noise of the stamping mills was a constant roar. It grated on his nerves. Suddenly, he saw a flicker of color. It was a flash of red against the gray, weathered wood of the bakery. He stopped. His boots ground into the dry dirt. He looked down at the girl on the crate. He saw how her hands were bone-thin. She was clutching her middle as if to hold herself together. He saw the streaks of dirt on her pale face. But he also saw an unnatural dignity in her posture. Even while starving, she tried to keep her back straight. Silas had seen death many times in these mountains. He knew the look of a person who was fading away. He didn't speak to her right away. He just stood there. His long shadow fell over her like a heavy blanket. An Lee felt the sudden change in the light. She looked up slowly.
Her eyes were dark and clouded with deep exhaustion. She expected a harsh word. She expected a shove. She expected to be told to move along and die elsewhere. Instead, the man reached into his worn leather vest. His hand was large and weathered. He pulled out a small, shriveled piece of dried apple. He held it out to her in his open palm. And Lee stared at the fruit. She didn't reach for it at first. She stared at the apple as if kindness had become something dangerous. Her breath hitched in her throat. Tears gathered in her eyes before she finally moved. She accepted it with shaking hands. "Eat," Silas said. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble. It sounded like distant thunder over the peaks. She didn't understand the English word, but she understood the ancient language of the gesture. Her fingers trembled as she brought the fruit to her lips.
She ate it in 2 quick, desperate bites. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. It tasted of rain and life. Silas watched her. He felt his heart twist in a way it hadn't in years. He looked around the busy street. People were stopping to stare. Women were whispering behind their painted fans. The tension in the air was thick and sharp. The Chinese Exclusion Act had just been signed into law. President Chester A. Arthur had signed it only months before. In a town like Bodie, that meant danger. Many people in Bodie twisted the new law into an excuse to treat every Chinese stranger as unwanted. It was a dark stain on the soul of the nation. But Silas Thorne did not care for the laws of distant men. He did not care for politicians in marble buildings. He cared about the law of the land and the sky. The law of the land said you do not let a person starve. He turned and walked into the bakery. The bell above the door jangled loudly. A moment later, he emerged with a full loaf of bread. It was warm and smelled of yeast and fire. He broke the loaf in half with his strong hands. He handed the larger piece to the girl. "Come with me," he said. He gestured toward his horse and the sturdy wagon nearby. And Lee looked at the bread in her hands. She looked up at the man's eyes. She saw no cruelty in the depths of his gaze. She saw only a profound, weary kindness. She stood up from her crate. Her legs wobbled like those of a newborn calf. Silas reached out a hand to steady her. His grip was firm and sure. It was the first time in weeks she felt she wouldn't fall. He helped her up onto the wooden bench of the wagon. He took her small battered trunk and tossed it in the back. As they drove down the main street, the whispers turned to shouts. A woman in a fine lace dress glared from the sidewalk.
"You're making a grave mistake, Silas," she yelled. "You can't bring her here."
Silas did not even turn his head to look at her. He flicked the leather reins. The horses strained and the wagon moved forward. The noise of Bodie began to fade behind them. The sound of the stamping mills became a dull hum. The air turned cooler as they climbed into the hills. The scent of pine replaced the smell of the mines. Ann Lee clutched the warm bread to her chest. She did not know where they were going. She did not know if she was truly safe, but she knew she was no longer alone in the dust. The ranch was a modest, lonely place. It was a sturdy cabin built of hand-hewn logs. The roof was steep to shed the winter snow. A small barn stood nearby with a sagging door. A stream bubbled with clear, icy mountain water. It was a place of hard work and honest sweat. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch. He hopped down and walked around to her side. He offered his hand again. He did not touch her more than was necessary. He could sense the deer-like fear in her eyes. He pointed to the heavy door of the cabin. "Home," he said. He repeated the words slowly and clearly. "Home." Ann Lee whispered the word back to him. The sound was tiny and unfamiliar on her tongue. Inside, the cabin was dim and cool. It smelled of pine smoke and old leather. It was a man's house. It was functional and sparse. But there was a quilt on the bed with bright red patterns. There were leather-bound books on a shelf by the hearth. Silas moved to the iron stove. He began to stoke the dying embers of the fire. He put a heavy pot of water on to boil. He moved with a quiet, steady efficiency.
Ann Lee found his movements soothing. She sat at the small, scrubbed wooden table. She watched him move about the small space. He brought her a bowl of thick beef stew. It was rich and salty and filled with garden potatoes. Ann Lee ate slowly this time. Her body was reacting to the sudden gift of food. Tears began to leak from the corners of her eyes. They were not tears of sadness or mourning. They were tears of pure, overwhelming relief. Silas sat across from her at the table. He sipped a cup of bitter black coffee. He didn't ask her for anything. He didn't demand she work or pay her way. He just let her exist in the quiet. As the sun set, the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind began to howl through the eaves of the roof. Anne Lee shivered in her thin silk tunic. Silas stood up and fetched a heavy wool blanket. It was scratchy but thick and warm. He draped it carefully over her shoulders. "Sleep," he said, pointing to a cot in the corner. He took the main bed for himself, she assumed. But Silas did not sleep in the bed that night. He took a canvas bedroll to the floor by the door. He laid it out across the threshold. He was protecting her from the world outside. He was a silent sentry in the dark of the mountains. That first night was the quietest Anne Lee had ever known. In the days that followed, a new rhythm took hold. Silas would leave before dawn to check the cattle. Anne Lee would remain at the cabin alone. She did not sit idle for long. She began to clean the layers of dust from the logs. She scrubbed the floor until the grain of the wood gleamed. She washed the grease from the small glass windows. She found a small, forgotten bag of rice in the pantry. She cooked it perfectly over the iron stove. She added wild onions she found by the stream. When Silas returned that evening, he stopped at the door.
The cabin felt like a living thing again. It no longer felt like a tomb for his memories. He noticed the clean windows immediately. He looked at the bowl of steaming rice on the table. He looked at Anne Lee, who stood by the stove. She had washed the dirt of Bodie from her face. Her dark hair was tied back neatly with a piece of twine. She looked younger and full of hidden strength. She looked like she belonged in the silence of the hills. They began to teach each other the names of things. He would point to the wooden chair. "Chair," he would say with a nod. "Chair," she would repeat, mimicking his low tone. She would point to the dancing flames in the hearth. "Whoa," she said softly. "Whoa," he tried to say. His deep voice struggled with the delicate sound. They both laughed for the first time. It was a fragile, beautiful sound. It filled the corners of the room where the shadows hid. But the world outside the ranch was not so kind. One afternoon, a lone rider approached the gate. It was the town sheriff, a man named Miller. He had a grim, tired expression on his face. Silas met him at the fence. He carried his rifle in the crook of his arm. "Silas," the sheriff said, staying mounted, "there's talk in town that won't die down. People in Bodie always have something to say, Miller. This is different, and you know it." The sheriff looked toward the cabin window. "That girl. Men in town are saying the new law means she shouldn't be here. She's not hurting a soul, Miller. That doesn't matter to the men in the saloons. They're looking for someone to blame for the mines. The silver is running thin, and they're angry." "She's under my roof," Silas said. His voice was like granite. "That makes her my business, and no one else's."
The Exclusion Act is federal law, Silas. The sheriff sighed and adjusted his hat. "Just a warning. Men are talking about coming up." "Let them come," Silas replied. His eyes were hard and cold as winter ice. The sheriff shook his head and rode away. Anne Lee had been watching from the window. She did not need to know the English words. She understood the posture of a man making a threat. She saw the way Silas gripped his rifle. She saw the tension in his broad shoulders. Before we continue, if you find this story of courage moving, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more tales of the human spirit from the old frontier. That night, Anne Lee sat by the fire with a heavy heart. She did not want to bring blood to this man's porch. He had saved her life when she was a ghost. She owed him everything she had left. She took out a small silk pouch from her tunic. Inside was a single, heavy gold coin. It was her dowry, saved by her father in a village far away. She had hidden it from the vultures in Bodie. She walked over to Silas. She placed the gold in his hand. She whispered several words in Chinese. Her voice was thick with emotion. Then, after a long pause, she forced out a single English word. "Go." She pointed toward the door in the distant town. She wanted him to take the gold and send her away. She wanted him to be safe from the coming storm. Silas looked at the gold for a long moment. He looked at the small, desperate hand that offered it. Then he slowly closed her fingers around the gold again. "No," he said firmly. He looked her straight in the eyes. "You stay." He didn't want her father's gold. He didn't want a servant.
He wanted her to be a person again.
Anne Lee began to sob, her shoulders shaking. She leaned her head against his rough leather vest. He did not pull away. He put a large, heavy hand on the top of her head. It was a moment of pure human connection. The trouble arrived exactly 3 days later. It was a group of 5 men from the town. They were led by a man named Sterling. Sterling was a failed miner with a mean streak. He blamed his empty pockets on anyone who looked different. They arrived at dusk, their horses kicking up dust. The setting sun turned the sky the color of blood. Silas was already waiting on the porch. He sat in a wooden chair with his rifle across his knees. Anne Lee was inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Bring out the girl, Thorne," Sterling shouted. Silas did not move an inch. "You're trespassing on private land," he said. "We're here to enforce the law of the land. She's an illegal, and she's gotta go. The law doesn't say you can harass a woman, not on my property and not on my watch. We don't care what a hermit thinks, Silas." Sterling's hand moved toward his holster. Silas raised the rifle he had already been holding. He fired into the fence post beside Sterling. The loud crack echoed through the canyon. Bark flew from the wood near the man's head. The horses reared and whinnied in terror. The men froze in their saddles. "The next one won't hit a post," Silas said. His voice was steady and devoid of fear. His eyes were like flint striking steel. The men looked at each other with uncertainty. They were cowards at heart, looking for an easy mark. Silas Thorne was not an easy mark. "This isn't over, Silas," Sterling spat into the dirt. "You're a traitor to your own kind." They turned their horses and galloped away. But the victory felt hollow in the cold air.
Silas knew they would go to the judge next. He knew he couldn't fight a whole territory with a rifle. He walked back into the cabin and closed the door. Anne Lee was standing in the middle of the room. She held a heavy iron skillet like a weapon. She was ready to fight by his side. Silas looked at her and felt a surge of pride. He realized then that he could not lose her. "We have to be smart," he said. The next morning, Silas rode into Bodie and sent an urgent telegram to an old friend in San Francisco. The man was a lawyer who understood the intricate paths of federal law. 4 days later, the attorney arrived by stagecoach, carrying copies of the documents Silas had described. That morning, Silas and Anne Lee dressed with great care. Silas wore his only black suit, smelling of mothballs. Anne Lee wore her red silk wedding tunic. It was clean now, the gold threads bright again. She wore it with her head held high. They drove the wagon back into the heart of Bodie. The news of the standoff had spread like wildfire. People stared from the boardwalks, but no one moved. They walked into the courthouse with steady steps. The judge was an older man with a white beard. Judge Hensley was known for being fair but firm. He looked at Silas, then at the girl in red. "What's this about, Silas?" the judge asked. "I am asking the court to recognize her right to remain while her papers are reviewed," Silas said. "On what grounds?" "Mr. Chen brought her here under documents connected to his merchant status. His death did not erase those papers. It did not turn her into a criminal." Judge Hensley looked toward the attorney Silas had summoned. The lawyer placed a certificate on the desk. "The federal act bars Chinese laborers," the lawyer said. "It does not give a mob the right to seize a woman who entered under a merchant's household documents." The judge examined the papers in silence. "And where does she wish to live while the authorities review her case?" Silas looked at Anne Lee. "Anne Lee," he said softly. "Stay?"
She stepped forward and took his hand. "Stay," she said clearly. Judge Hensley nodded. "Then this court will issue an order protecting her person from interference. No citizen of Bodie may remove or threaten her without lawful authority." It was a victory, a small one, but it was enough to breathe. As they walked out, Sterling was waiting. He stood on the sidewalk, looking furious. "You think you won something today, Silas?" Silas stopped directly in front of the man. "She's a human being, Sterling. That's more than I can say for you." Sterling stepped back, his face turning a deep red. Anne Lee looked at the man who had tried to hurt her. She didn't feel fear anymore. She reached into her pocket. She drew out a piece of dried apple Silas had packed for them that morning. She held it out to Sterling in her open palm. It was a gesture of peace and forgiveness. Sterling stared at the dried apple. For the first time, he was unable to meet her eyes. His bravado crumbled into confusion. Without another word, he turned and walked away.
They drove back to the ranch as the first snow fell. Ann Lee watched the white flakes with wide eyes. She reached out a hand to catch a single flake. "Beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Silas said, looking only at her. The winter that followed was long and brutal. The snow piled up against the logs of the cabin, but inside they were warm and safe. They spent the long, dark evenings by the hearth. Silas taught her to read from his leather books. She taught him to cook with herbs he never knew. One evening, Ann Lee found a small wooden box. Inside was a silver hair comb with fine teeth. It had belonged to Clara many years ago. Ann Lee brought the box to Silas with trembling hands. Instead of anger, he smiled a sad, gentle smile.
He walked over to her and tucked it into her hair. "It looks good on you, Ann Lee," he said. Ann Lee felt a warmth spread through her entire body. She realized then that she wasn't a replacement. She was a new chapter in a book that hadn't ended. As the months passed, gratitude slowly became something deeper. By early spring, the review confirmed that Ann Lee's merchant household documents were valid. She was free to remain, and no court order bound her to Silas or his ranch. That evening, Silas sat beside her near the fire. "You are free to go wherever you wish," he said. "You owe me nothing." Ann Lee looked at the man who had given her safety without ever demanding her heart. She took his hand and placed it over her own. "I am home," she said. Silas asked her to marry him only after making certain she understood that the choice was hers. They were married as the wildflowers began to bloom across the high meadows. Ann Lee was no longer the starving girl in red silk. She was a woman with a future, a home, and a name she had chosen for herself. Years later, the red silk tunic rested in a wooden box beside Clara's silver comb. Every anniversary of the day they met, Silas placed one piece of dried apple on Ann Lee's plate. Their daughter would laugh and ask why such a small thing mattered so much. Ann Lee would take Silas's hand and answer, "Because once it was enough to bring me home." Outside, the wind moved through the pines above the thorn ranch. Inside, the cabin that had once known only silence was filled with warmth, voices, and light. The dust of Bodie never truly settled. But Silas and Ann Lee had found something stronger than gold. They had found each other. If you were touched by Silas and Ann Lee's journey, please leave a comment below. Tell us what you think about this act of kindness. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. The end.